Morning, you are on the Reflective Teacher from the British Council. Just before we begin and I share with you my prepared material for this session, I just want to check that everything is okay on your end and also on my end, and that you can hear everything that I'm saying nice and clear. So you should be watching this on a YouTube live stream, and if you look on the right hand side of the screen, there is a chat box. Type in the city you are currently in. That will be helpful, and let me know that everything is good, that you can hear me, and let me know a little bit about you, where you're from. During the talk, there'll be opportunities for questions and answers also, so we can have an interactive element. That being the case as well, you'll also need to use the chat box for that. Again, the same one on the right-hand side next to the video window. You should be able to see that next to my head. So type in there if there's any questions or comments that you have. There'll be designated times for us to have a question and answer, but feel free to type in at any point and I can read the comments and pick them up when it's necessary. Okay, so I'm just going to see if that chat box works for me as well. And that seems to have put a bit of text in the box also. So as I say, if you're watching, don't be shy and add something as well. So I'm just going to share my screen with you now so you can see my materials for the reflective. So I'm just going to put this in the full screen mode. And there we are, we can see all of that now. So I'm going to be narrating over the top of this PowerPoint presentation. So feel free to make notes and such like as we go along. Just one note on how we're going to do it, because I always find it very distracting when looking at a PowerPoint given by a presenter and having to read and listen at the same time. So every time I change slides, we'll just have a 5-10 second pause to allow you just to read the notes before I begin speaking. So this means we won't have any distraction between us, and that also means that you'll be prepared for the slides that come up as we go and be able to pay attention a little bit better. So again, we've got the teachingenglish.org.uk website available for teachers, and this is an excellent lesson plans and blogs written by teachers around the world. It has a search function which enables you to look for any particular type of practical teaching or technique or area of teaching that you would like more information on, and you can find lots of information as well as details of research that have been conducted by your colleagues, people like you, and British Council staff members working in our teaching centres globally. As I say, there are lesson plans available for download. There are also forums that you can communicate and discuss teaching techniques with your colleagues and people globally. And as of course, it's good stuff for the reflective teacher. Also, if it's something you're interested in the terms of writing, you can contact the webmasters there about submitting your own blog or piece of written material to share with your colleagues if that's something that you might be interested in, and it might well be at the end of this presentation. So we're just going to go on to the next slide. So this is just some information about me, just giving you my credentials so you know who's talking to you and why I'm talking to you today about reflect. So I was the training manager in Sri Lanka for 2 years, where we delivered CELTA courses as well as the Trinity Young Learner Extension Certificate, the TKT. And we managed to set up as well Colombo Center to be a Delta orientation center, meaning people could take the further diploma in South Asia in the British Council there in Sri Lanka without having to travel a bit more further. And as you can see, I was a teaching center manager for the British Council in Baku, where I was line managing a series of teachers, local and international, and taking care of their teacher reflection and development and their professional development from there. And also engaged in Israel in teacher development over the entirety of the country in conjunction, as you can see, with the Ministry of Education via the Routes to Excellence program that we had there. And this was a series of face-to-face and digital webinars, just like we're having together now. So currently I'm acting as a cultural and educational consultant, specializing in bringing together arts and language. Take a few seconds for me. So teacher reflection is very specifically how you think about yourself and your practice. Now, this is necessary so you're not trapped in a kind of autopilot. You might have been teaching for 1 month, you might have been teaching for 1 year, or even longer, 5 years, 10 years. But it's very important we don't get stuck in the same routines and practices. And this can be a danger unless we're thinking about ourselves and our practice in a constructive and objective way. And this is the primary sense of teacher reflection. So in this respect, it's a means for you to develop your practice, what you do in the classroom, and also your teaching philosophy, your pedagogy, the kinds of materials and things that you will be using in the classroom. And as such, it is a means for you to develop your career, to decide if you want to stay in the classroom, and if so, if you're something perhaps interested in more managerial or administration or writing-based professions. Teacher reflection will help you decide if that's something that's appropriate for you and that you're interested in. Now, a key word here is objective. If you're not objectively observing what you're doing, then the reflection might not be particularly useful. So we're going to be looking at how you can be as objective as possible to step back, as we say, and look at what you're doing and why you're doing that. I'm just going to stop sharing the screen just for a moment so I can check in on the chat box. Sorry, I don't want to lean too close to you. So we've got people from Poltava. So hello, Alexander and Tanya, and Olina from Cherkasy State Technological University. And good afternoon, Daria. Okay, so that chat box seems to be working well. And as I say, we'll be back and forth as we go along. So thanks for joining in there. And we're going to get back to the PowerPoint share just now, and we can continue. So again, the next slide. What we're going to do specifically, so I'm always signposting at the beginning of webinars exactly what we're going to be looking at. So if you can just look at that for a few seconds for me. So different ways of encouraging a reflective practice. There are many different ways that you can step back and look at what you do in the classroom as objectively as possible. And of course, because there are many different ways, you have to decide which ones are the most appropriate for you and stick with that. Or you might decide to use a combination of all of those just to see how it goes. So we're going to be looking at the different methods that you can bring. It's also useful, I think, when we're defining something not just to look at something positively, but also in a negative sense. In other words, we want to learn more about teacher reflection by thinking a little bit about what teacher reflection is not. So from techniques in the classroom to teach things through the negative. So if we say that what something is not, it lets us appreciate a little more and hone in a more precise way exactly what we're talking about. Now, I find personally webinars very useful when I view them, but I find them more useful if I've got something to take away with me after the webinar, some action points and some immediate practical steps for me to follow. This helps me remember what I've watched, but it also makes immediate real world change as soon as I've finished watching, and just stops me being a bit lazy. So I assume the same is true for you as well. So the last couple of slides will be concerned with action points that you can immediately implement after this webinar to start at your reflective practice and make some changes in teaching and get that ball rolling and see how we do from there. And as I've already mentioned, we'll be having separate Q&A sessions marked by Q&A slides, so you know when to expect them, just to more interesting, and that way you don't have to sit and listen to me only for the entire hour talking and talking and talking and talking. So this way we can keep it a bit more interactive, as well as go beyond the material that I've only prepared for this presentation. So that way we can make the questions and the answers I give a little bit more specific for you in your contexts. So, and you can ask me about anything we're covering in this session today. Not just questions, you can also share comments so we can get some dialogue. So please don't be shy. The more you input and the more information you give on that chat box on the right-hand side, the more I'm able to give you and the more useful the webinar will be. So we want this to be a kind of community experience there. So I just want to start off with a personal example about why teacher reflection is important. If you just look at my bullet points there detailing my first year of teaching, just for, we'll give it that about 5 seconds again. So I started teaching in 2003, about 1,000 years ago now. And of course, I took the CELTA, which is concerned mostly with what we call the PPP model. And something that I'm sure you're completely familiar with, as this is the sort of standard foundation that language teaching takes in the classroom now. If you're not using the traditional teacher-centered pedagogy that concentrates mostly on grammar translation, you're probably using this. And this is where we have presentation, practice, and of course, production. So this is where one language point, one grammar point, one set of vocabulary or lexis is chosen by the teacher and planned before the lesson. It is then presented in class through a context, because of course language only means something in context and must therefore be presented in context. You then give your students some practice, whether or not it's practice in interaction with them speaking to each other. Perhaps it's a more formal practice in a gap fill. And then we end with production, where hopefully your students are then speaking the target language at the end of the lesson, if all has gone well. And this is what we do lesson by lesson, language point by language point, the language to our students in increments. So this is what I was trained to do when I took the CELTA in London. So this is therefore all I did all the time. And my first job was in Nizhnevartovsk in Russia, in the Khanty-Mansiysk region in Siberia. And I had very patient students as well who were new to the technique, as this wasn't something that was very common in Siberia at that time, and it was very effective. I was new and inexperienced and only had been practicing at that point for a few months as a teacher, and therefore I couldn't use anything other than PPP. So I was very careful to follow my textbooks, write my lesson plans, and it was always in that PPP style with no other kind of variety, no experimentation, and nothing else. So it was very much based on routine. And routine can become a bit over repetitive and rote. So could those lessons have been more effective? Well, yes, they could. Not just in the sense that I could have used other pedagogical techniques such as task-based learning or test, teach, test, which again, you might be familiar with. But also I didn't practice different ways of even doing PPP. It was literally always the same way. Your talk was always at the same amount. My body language was always said in the same way. The interaction patterns for the students were the same way. The content and context of the classes were always the same. So if we had an elementary level class and we were teaching countable versus uncountable nouns, then of course, every single lesson, we were talking about what's in Gary's fridge. There are some tomatoes. There is some milk. There are 16 eggs, etc., etc. So it became very predictable and I think very boring for the students. It was certainly boring for me because I was going in the classroom doing the same thing again and again. And students knew what was going to happen, which can lower their ability to take in more information. So when I was, for example, setting up pair work or group work, students would often finish my sentences for me like, yes, teacher, now you're going to ask us to talk to our partner. We know. Yes, teacher, now we have to discuss it in a group. We know. Very boring. And when something becomes very repetitive like that, you can get stressed. It can be stressful for you as the teacher trying to find new ways of doing something because you have then that expectation of you from yourself, but also from your students. But also it can be quite stressful as you wonder, is this what you're going to be doing forever? When the novelty value wears off, you don't want to be doing the same thing. It can get pretty dull pretty quickly. So I had to go through a period of teacher reflection since, and I've done lots of different things. And I was able to go through that teacher reflection because I had very, very good and effective line managers, colleagues. I had access to printed material. Back in 2003, because I'm of course so very, very old now, there really wasn't much in the way of internet, and what internet there was in Russia was on a dial-up connection and very slow. And then what was on the internet, regardless of where you were in the world, was very limited. Whereas now, of course, in 2017, we've all got wonderful, speedy broadband connections and access to lots and lots of material. So I did very well with that limitation, whereas you now have that foundation plus the internet as an excellent resource. So we're going to be looking at ways for you to take advantage of all of those things and avoid that repetition and that teacher. You don't end up forever like I was in my first year of teaching, becoming a bit predictable, becoming a little bit bored. So we're going to go on to the next slide now. And again, you just take 10 seconds to look through that for me. So this is a summary pretty much of what we've said about reflective practice so far. The main point being it allows you to take control. Now, a lot of, I think, dissatisfaction, a lot of stress and a lot of feelings of helplessness in teaching, as in other areas of life comes from you not having that feeling of control. If you're continually doing what your school management say or what your course book says, and you're continually doing what your lessons plan say again and again and again, it's very easy for you to lack that sense of control and agency, which leads to stress and general unhappiness. So reflective practice will allow you to start changing things, doing things your way based on your actual needs that you identify through reflection, and allow you to take. And of course, when you take control and it's meaningful, you're directing and adding to your students' learning in a much more dynamic and effective manner than just passively following what's in the course book again and again and again. So, of course, this stops the repetitive nature of a dull pedagogical framework. Now, when we're engaged in the process of reflection, you'll notice that there are many, many things you can improve and so change. Now, it might be very formally and straightforwardly focused on what you do simply. It could be completely connected only to your actual techniques, whether or not improve in PPP or TBL or any of those other teaching techniques, or it might be something a little bit more broader, a bit more personal, such as how you speak to people and how you control yourself in the classroom. So there's a very broad framework of things we can be looking at there. And a good practice of reflection will allow you to hone and focus on those things specifically and know you're not wasting your time in doing so. Engaged in some change and some reflection for a while, of course, you learn a lot. It's not just your students that learn. And this process of learning gives you the ability to share, whether or not you then create in-service teacher training. You might create an article, write a blog post. So this lets you share with colleagues and become a teacher trainer and delivering teacher training, and so develop your career a little bit more like that, or open up new possibilities of different kinds of work for you. Likewise, if we're thinking away from the purely practical matter of teaching, we can look at things like your research interests. So by going through the period of teacher reflection, you can see that you're more interested in some things than other. For example, you might be very much interested in the role of Lexis versus grammar teaching. You might decide that the efficacy of resource-free teaching is something that interests you, and you can then use this as a basis to pursue further research and action research, which in turn leads to better classroom practice, or perhaps to some articles, some training, or giving some seminars, etc., etc. So it all depends where you start and what you highlight. And of course, all of these things going together will let your career as you know where you want to go, and you won't just be going through those motions stuck in the same place again and again and again forever and ever. So let's look a bit more specifically on how we start our reflective practice. So observation, the most obvious, I suppose, part of reflective practice, and this is why it's our first practical slide. Now, it's also the one that upsets and worries or causes more stress for people. When this is engaged with being an observation from your line manager or senior teacher or director of studies, whoever has that hierarchical privilege in your school or teaching context. Very, very few people actively like observations. Even people that will seek out and ask for observations because they're doing teacher reflection don't necessarily like them. I don't really think I've met anyone who can honestly say they enjoy the period of observation, but they are necessary. Now, an observation from your line manager often have external requirements from the school, in that they will have their own philosophy and they will have their own list of criteria for what they're watching from you as a teacher, and that forms the feedback that they give you to allow you to take that feedback, think about what you're doing, and so change. standard and par for the course. So we were talking about how you can take control and how you can direct your teacher reflection and so your development. And the way we do that in the case of a line manager or director observation is to make sure that your observation then is not conducted purely as something externally imposed or operating only to the criteria of the institution or the observer. In this respect, you should give your observer 3 things that you would like them to comment on specifically. And these 3 things could, of course, be your teacher talking time with students, as well, more specifically based on anything you would like examined on your lesson plan or how you're acting in the classroom. So agreeing that beforehand with your observer will allow you to influence the course of the observation and allow you to take a bit more control of that observation. And you'll find that this makes the observation a little bit more comfortable and a little bit less stressful, as well as giving you focused and targeted and therefore useful feedback as a result of that observation, rather than it all coming from another person. So in this sense, once you've had this observation, you've got 2 different streams of feedback coming to you, one imposed by the authority outside of you, but one chosen by yourself. So even when your period of teacher reflection is taken from somebody else, an authority figure, it can still be used for your own period of control and very specifically for you and directed by you. And I've just put a little warning at the bottom saying, be honest. So in my years of observing lessons, I noticed that teachers would often try their best to present their best lesson, a lesson perhaps they got from a friend, or a lesson that they had spent many, many hours and weeks putting together themselves just for the purposes of that observation. And you might think at first glance that, but the problem is putting lessons like that in just for an observation, you can see that the lessons, those specific types of lessons, are not necessarily connected with what has gone before in the teaching practice and what's coming after. So it's something that students often will be unfamiliar with because it's the teacher's special lesson just for the observation. And it doesn't give the observer an accurate presentation of what you normally do in the class. Something useful away from an observation, and for it to make real and definite change for your teaching practice and thus your period of reflection, your observer must be a standard lesson for you and not an overly polished, overly worked on, perfected lesson, as it's unrealistic. And therefore any feedback that you get, any information you get from that observation might not be entirely useful or applicable for you as it applies to a different standard or different kind of teaching, because that's not how you practice generally. So of course you should still take care to give a good lesson and be very careful with your lesson planning and whatever other criteria is asked of you for the observation, but it should not be purposely of a different league or a different type of teaching to what you normally do. So never teach to impress at an observation, always teach to be authentic and honest. This is a very important point if you're going to use observations well. So another type of observation, not practiced as regularly as the line manager or director observation, is the peer observation, where you simply get a colleague or friend to observe you teach. And of course, this is a colleague who is also themselves a teacher, so that they can give you that more principled and authoritative feedback. But because they're not in a position of authority over you or in a hierarchy, this makes it a little bit less nerve-wracking, a little bit less stress-inducing, and you can also be a little more honest than you perhaps could with the manager. And that elevated level of honesty then gives you that much better feedback, which is more useful for you. Now, the main benefits, I think, of a peer observation is that you can completely be in control of what your colleague is looking at, down to where you can create your own handout rather than use the institutional handout that your school would normally have you use. And on this handout, you can be as informal and as flippant as you like. You can put in jokes for your friend. You can put in whatever you want to put in there. More specifically, you can put in the instructions you want them to take a note of. And again, you can be imaginative here. Normal observations are going to be looking at your teacher talking time. They're going to be looking at how closely you follow the lesson plan. A normal observation will be looking at how well you're doing your PPP or your grammar translation. But when you have an informal observation with a colleague, you can ask them to look at anything you like. They could even have them asking to look at your dress sense that day for the class if this is something that you think might be useful to know. It can be asking them to look at your choice of vocabulary. If they know you well, they're more likely to notice your individual verbal tics or repeated words than a more anonymous observer. So this is your chance to really make sure that the observation you have is more focused and tailor-made and specific for the useful thing. When you're making such a you might like to base some of guidance for them to observe observations from the more traditional type of observation, or you might worry the observer is blind, is that you don't give the observer a great deal of information about the class, its aims, or the class profile before you do it. Normally in an observation, of course, you tell the observer your main aim, you share your lesson plan, you give them as much information about the students. But I find informal observation, you're much more likely to be honest with the observer, and they're more likely to be more honest and informal with you as well. And you can take advantage of that and have a blind observation where they simply come in with no prior knowledge. And then their task, one of their main tasks, is to watch the lesson and identify for themselves what they think the main aim is, what they think your subsidiary aims are, as well as follow the observer's handout that you've given them. So in this way, again, you're ensuring you get two different feedback streams. You're getting the feedback that you've requested on the observer's handout, but you're also getting their honest feedback that comes from them simply watching your lesson. So you get feedback authentic to them as an objective observer, and because they're also a teacher, it's going to be useful, authoritative feedback. So can you identify the main aim of my lesson as something I strongly recommend you putting on in a blind observation? Because of course, if they can't identify that main aim, you know you've got more basic problems to be looking at. Okay, so that's done for observation, I think. So just so far, before we continue, we've looked at what reflective practice is. We've looked at why it's important. We've given you an example from my history, and we've looked at the most basic way that probably everybody already knows of starting a period of teacher reflection, which is, of course, the line manager observation and the peer observation. So we're going to continue and become more specific and look at some other things. Just before we do we have any questions or comments about what I've shared so far, or do we have any requests about what you would like me to talk about? We continue. So if you have anything to share, any questions, comments, or statements, then please put those into the chat box now. And as I say, don't be shy, because the more you share, the more we can make this an interactive webinar. So we're just going to give you 20 seconds for that. Okay, no takers, so we're just going to continue. Video aids to reflection. So just take 5 slide for me and we'll go through that. While we're looking at that, Kostian has asked, do I ever use any interactive games with students? So interactive games, I think really the primary thing you would be doing in the classroom, because if your games are not interactive, or indeed not just games, any activity that you do and the main foundation of your lesson as a whole, if you don't have any sense of interaction there, and by interaction, I don't mean teacher to student, I mean student to student or student to group. Your classroom then takes on that very, very teacher-centered aspect. You can have that teacher-centered aspect because you might be favoring grammar translation, or you have a very lecture-centered approach. But I think interactive activity should certainly be something you're doing all the time, rather than just something as a 10-minute or 20-minute interlude in your classroom. And again, there's so many of these things that you can do. If you go to teachingenglish.org with the British Council and just type in interactive activities as those 2 keywords, you'll get a wealth of things to look at. And this then can compose part of your teacher reflection as you experiment with using all of those different things. But if you're a teacher who tends not to have those interactive elements, then I very, very strongly recommend that you use that as a cornerstone of your reflective practice. Maybe you should have asked for it a bit later. No, Kostian, that was exactly the correct time, the first Q&A session. So thank you for your question. And now we're going to just, as I say, move back on to my PPT. So audio and visual. We've all had that experience of you have a dictaphone or some recording device and you record your voice. You might read something. You might recite a poem from memory, bit of whatever experience. Actually, what I sound like, is that my voice? So even on that very basic level, recording yourself can be, as I've written, extremely illuminating. The act of recording, it objectifies you as a person, but in the best possible sense. You can then observe yourself as somebody else would. And this gives you an incredible amount of information about yourself you really would not have noticed before. And of course, this effect is doubled if you're using video. Common things to check, of course, are the teacher talking time and how you're standing, repeated physical tics, by which I mean running your hands through your hair, scratching your nose, etc. There are equivalent verbal tics. So you overusing any particular words or phrases, which can then become distracting to the students or just take up time in the classroom that aren't particularly useful. Are you already aware of something that you do with your voice, something that you do with your body in the classroom that you want to stop? So by recording yourself, either just with audio or video, will allow you to objectively examine that and so make a much better plan of action for stopping those repetitions and things like that, and make your body language that much more effective for the classroom, whether you're standing, whether you're sitting. Of course, we recommend that you spend most of the time in the class sitting to make sure you have that coherence in the classroom and encourage the interaction. So you might find upon watching your first filmed observation of yourself that you actually spend a lot of time standing up and you weren't even aware of that. So that's an example of just a first initial step that you can take that's very useful to changing your teaching practice. Also, not just how much you talk, but its speed. I think we often find that we speak a lot quicker than we think we do. And you can take conscious steps to slow down your speech, especially useful in the language classroom, if you're able to actually listen to yourself and know how fast your speech is going, especially if you spend a lot of your lesson time speaking in the target language. Now, depending on your teaching context, you might be using L1, and it's very important you make sure if that justified. If you're using L1 in a language classroom, whether your first language is Ukrainian, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, whatever, it's really important that all of the students in the class can also understand your L1. Many times in many teaching contexts, that is not the case. And if you are using the L1 for teaching purposes, is it justified? Can you do it in English instead, or the other target language that you're teaching? Again, sometimes L1 is necessary. But recording yourself speak not only highlights when you could have done it in English, it can also highlight to yourself just when you're using L1 for no reason, maybe because you're nervous and you're making jokes, or you're just talking for talk's sake. So the audio-visual reflection can aid you in cutting those bits out of your teaching practice and making your classes leaner, more focused, and better. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about you as the teacher, how your body language is going, how your voice sounds, how you deliver yourself, but don't forget about the students. This is something which is often really neglected, especially in observations, the more traditional observations. And of course, with students' permission, allows you to look at them. How do they look? Not just are they interacting as you want them to, are they all in the pair work, are they all in the group work that you asked for, but also, what do they look like in the classroom? Are your students leaning forward, looking up at you with great interest and awe, and they think you're a wonderful teacher? Or do you find that your students, especially if you're teaching teenagers, tend to slouch back and sit back on the chair, legs stuck out, eyes looking down? Again, these are the details we often miss in the classroom, or we only have the time to look at these details for one or two students. But watching a video of ourselves teaching allows us not only to look at all of the students, but to highlight those aspects, those different parts of the lesson where the student's body language and receptivity changes. So if you find they're sitting up and sitting forward at some points, and then looking a bit more disinterested at other points, those are the points of your teaching that you can highlight objectively as being the ones that need work, or maybe just deletion from the classroom if it's a specific activity. Also, another very useful thing to look at in terms of students is what you ignore, which ones do you favor? And again, this can be on a par with the verbal or physical tics that we have as teachers, something you repetitively do, but which you're not completely aware of. So you might often ignore some students and favor others, and you're not completely conscious of doing so. And again, watching back one or two lessons can alert you to that, and thus allow you to spread your student interaction out over the class that more in an egalitarian manner, rather than just one or two. And you might be surprised at how often you actually do that. Now, of course, everyone has smartphones or iPods these days. So setting up teacher recording and self-recording is a lot easier than it used to be. So I strongly recommend you doing that. And as I say, doing so can be extremely illuminating. Then we have student feedback, something not practiced very often for different reasons. So just have a few seconds to look at that slide for me. So we're recommending that you're not asking students for feedback on pedagogy. When I've seen the results of teachers using student feedback previously, and teachers have shared with me the handouts that they've given students. So of course, you can give students handouts for them to complete during the lesson, or you can give them handouts to take away and answer some questions about your lesson once the lesson has finished. This is a useful technique. I see that quite a lot of teachers often ask students for very specific feedback about their pedagogy, about their teaching techniques, about how they did this listening lesson or how they conducted this particular reading lesson. And this is not a way of getting good feedback. And I think it's quite an obvious point, but it's something that's so common, I think it bears repeating. And this is because students simply are not experts on pedagogy. They know what they enjoy in a classroom. They know how roughly a listening lesson or a writing lesson or a reading lesson or a speaking lesson works. But they don't have your expertise on why it works and how to put one together. So if you're asking slightly technical questions to students about how long your pre-listening task was, and if your pre-listening task allowed them to do better at the post-listening questions, this is asking too much of your students. So therefore, any feedback you get is not going to be useful. And you might even find it that it's quite discouraging. But this is because students are not giving answers that actually reflect what has happened in the classroom. So make sure you're giving handouts and questionnaires to your students that not reflect your pedagogy, but reflect what they know about, what they can authoritatively comment on. And that's the lesson content, the subjects and topics you use, and what they're interested in, and just what parts of the lesson they have enjoyed and why. You then can read this. I enjoyed speaking to my partner. I enjoyed speaking to several different partners. You can look at that and realize that's because I did this staging. I therefore need to use these different interactive patterns. So when you get student feedback, it's your job to interpret that feedback and not just read it as you would from an observer. Students are able to give you feedback on what they enjoy and the topics they enjoy, not pedagogy. And this is a really important point, as this is the most, I think, overused and badly used aspect of teacher reflection. Of course, you should never ignore your students. They are the people in the classroom. They are the ones that can give you some very illuminating feedback. But it's your job, again, we're talking about you taking control. It's your job and role to make sure that you are making it absolutely possible in as best that feedback is specific and workable. So that's really important that it's reflected in the handouts that you give. So I like to give students handouts asking them what topics they've most enjoyed talking about, what content they most enjoyed after 5 or 6 lessons, and what they would like to see more of in future. Putting all of these together, you can make a top 5 list of the most popular topics or items of content and plan your lessons accordingly. And this stops what I was talking about earlier on, where every lesson we were talking about these very traditional coursebook contexts, where if you're teaching the present perfect, you're always talking about holidays. I have been to France. Have you been to France? If you're talking about countable and uncountable nouns, you're always talking about what's in your fridge. It gets very, very boring. Doing this kind of student feedback can save you from that repetition and really improve your teaching practice there and make your classes a lot more student-centered. And that's really a great way of using students to get feedback for your lessons and how you are in the classroom as a teacher. Criticism, as I say, it might be because you've given them the wrong type of handout and request, which is about pedagogy, which is what they do not know about. Any other type of criticism, try not to take it personally, especially when the way students criticize and the different ideas they can give can be based on many different factors and probably not the ones you think. Remember, you're thinking as a professional, you're thinking pedagogically. Other students might just be thinking, I didn't like that lesson because I had to talk to Sergey and I find him annoying. But they don't write that, of course, in the feedback. So always take students' feedback with some skepticism. Try not to take it personally. And remember, the quality of that feedback is determined by the quality of the handouts that you give. So statements of belief. If you just spend 10 seconds looking at this for me. So this is quite a powerful practice for reflection, getting away from the observation. And this is more inward directed, more focused, and a bit more of an introverted progress. But this is, I think, the most important part of teacher reflection. And this is where we have the teaching statements. Now, often when you're teaching, you're doing things because you've been told to. You're doing things because that's how you were trained to do them. Maybe you're doing things because that's how a specific line manager or director likes you to do them. You might be doing things because you've based your practice on unrealistic notions about student expectation. And the reasons why you do these things are often unconscious or not very well highlighted, where you have a kind of general or rough idea about, yeah, I do this because, and you can give an answer. But you'll often find that these answers are very vague and they don't differ much between yourself and your colleagues, especially if they have a similar background. So this exercise really lets you examine your beliefs about teaching and why you do the things you do, and can most powerfully affect your practice and really let you change based on what you actually think. Once you identify what you think, the change of the practice will follow. So what I recommend is a list of 5 teaching statements. For example, I believe that a language is best learned by practice, not by learning grammar. And then you interrogate that statement. Why do you think that's true? Did you read it in a magazine and you just unreflectingly adopted this belief? Did someone in a position of authority tell you, and therefore you have been acting on that belief all the time? If you forget that you like this belief, if you forget that it's something you're connected to, it allows you to think of arguments against it. Just for fun, you can think of arguments to something you believe in, but you might end up convincing yourself of those arguments or give better ideas. So for each of the 5 statements, I want you to interrogate each one. Where did it come from? Why do you think that? What would someone who disagrees with it think? What is the argument to the contrary? Once you've examined those notes, you can take from each of those statements and the questions around them action points for your teaching. So you might decide to avoid grammar gap fills because it's something you've always done, but on the process of reflection based on the statements of belief, you actually can't think of any good reason why you've been doing those grammar gap fills. And this is a surprising activity where you often find things like this happening, like, wow, I've been doing this for so many years, I've been doing this for so many months, and actually I do it. It just says to do it in the course book, but I don't know why it's effective. So examining your statements of belief will give some very interesting practical ideas and be quite illuminating on the things you already do. And this is the first serious step forward in your reflection as a teacher. Now, of course, if you're doing this level of reflection, you're doing the observations, you're looking at yourself with an audio visual recording, you've done your statements of belief, unless you've got the best memory in the world, it's useful, but it's not that useful if you cannot keep track of it. And this is where we recommend the reflective journal. It provides a written record of your period of teacher reflection as you go on. So you can look back at what you have written and see how you have done, giving yourself that sense of progress. But it also allows you to make sure that you stay on track and make the changes you want to make. And not only that, but those changes you're making accurately reflect what you really think and what you're really doing in the classroom. The act of writing itself can make you have ideas and have you think of criticisms of yourself you wouldn't normally think if you were just sitting back in a chair teaching generally. As we have with the Joan Didion quote, "I don't know what I think until I write it down." So the act of writing itself can be a very powerful process of reflection. Not only does it let you remember what you've done and keep that record, it actually pushes along and aids that reflection for yourself. And of course, you can choose to keep the reflective journal in English or any other language that you wish. So you can keep that flexible. But this is, again, a cornerstone, along with the 5 statements of belief. This is really a cornerstone of your reflective practice. And keeping your reflective journal together with feedback from your line manager, with written feedback from your peers, this allowed you to keep a portfolio of your teaching, a folder that is all about, you can go to at any time and which is useful. So of course, it's not all about what we're doing in the classroom. There are other benefits and things you can do. And here are some suggestions. In just 5 seconds again, look at those for me. So journal and the statements exercise, I think you'll be very surprised at all the ideas and things you can do next from those. So you might want to experiment with blogging. I've already mentioned teachingenglish.org.uk. This can give a profound sense of achievement if you can have something published that's international and that you can share with your peers, or you can set up your own blog as well. The sense of achievement comes from simply doing it and hitting publish. You can worry about the amount of readers you get later, but you can share that within your institution or with other people and start a conversation, thus establishing your own community. Or you can join a community. Again, teachingenglish.org has a variety of forums that you can join to have conversations with other people. And I'm sure you can find your own local Facebook groups as well, or vContact groups. I'm delivering a webinar, so can you. So you can set up webinars over Google Hangouts, your institution or any other institution such as the British Council, to see if they would be interested in having webinars delivered by you, if this is some aspect of professional development you're interested in. And also conferences. Now, of course, you don't have to start big with the keynote speech. You can start small by presenting a poster, which is, of course, just a pictorial representation of perhaps some research or ideas you have had that people can come and ask you about at the conference. And the British Council gives lessons and advice on how to develop with this on our section on action research. So if you look at that and follow that link, that'll give you some practical steps for creating a blog, sharing research, and making the first steps towards perhaps stepping into a conference if that's something you're interested in outside of the classroom. End with some questions and comments again. So Kostian's asking students giving feedback in a verbal or in a written form. I think written, if it's based on having the students observe the lesson, because you can collate all of that material and keep it in your portfolio to come and look at later, and you always have that written record. So written's better, and also it helps them focus their thoughts and you have access to it later. If you want some kind of verbal feedback, it's a good idea to keep it written, but you take the written form that the students have submitted to you. And what I like to do at the end of the term, to sit with the students with their written forms and have a question and answer session with them verbally based on the form. Because if you go for students for verbal feedback, it's unstructured and they'll happily just sit and talk at you for 20 minutes and things can get a bit strange. Whereas if you have their written feedback step by step, and you can see what they say and have extra feedback there. But primarily when you're doing student observation and feedback, it should be in a in a written context, I think. So that answers Daria's question, that the written context is better. Text box remains empty apart from Daria and Kostian. So thank you guys for your input. And if we just finish, what teacher reflection is not, it's not the self-criticism or allowing the critic in your head to get the other hand. And it's not making criticisms of others because you've noticed some things and you want them to notice some things either. So we're not making unjust criticisms of ourselves, and we're not sharing criticisms with our colleagues without good reason. And sometimes that can be a tempting thing to do. It's something we want to avoid. So reflection is not being too harsh on ourselves, and it's not sharing without prompting with our colleagues. And likewise, insisting that they should adopt practices which work well for you. Every teacher is different, and that's something we need to be very careful to respect. And I'm just going to leave you with this list of action points. So of course we have the statements, the 5 statements of belief. That's the main action point, but also try these. So think about a favorite activity, stop doing it, see what happens. Your personal journal with 250 words on what happens when you stop doing what you would normally do. Also, I strongly recommend telling your colleagues or your line manager or your friends, or even friends and family on Facebook, on vContact, on Twitter, that you're starting to examine your practice, because once you've told people, the social pressure will ensure you do what you say. And it's all about being observant. And this isn't just being observant at work. You can't always just these things from yourself. You need to practice being observant all the time, because it's a skill. So one thing that I enjoy doing is trying to notice 10 things about my journey to work I hadn't noticed before. You can do this on the metro, you can do it in a car, you can do it on the train, and of course you can do it if you walk to work. And this also just highlights and enhances your appreciation for your environment, which you probably ignore every day and go through the motions. And that's the lesson. You're doing things every day, you always do. Whereas now you're being observant, gives you more information, and that gives you the power of change. And teacher reflection, always more fun with a friend. Find a colleague who's also interested in developing as well, and just have a weekly chat. You could even share your teacher journal at the chat as well, to provide some sort of written structure to what you talk about. And again, so that doesn't have to be formal like it would be at work. It's much more informal, much more fun with a friend, and you'll get a lot more out of it. And if you can just see the summary link at the end, reflecting on your teaching outside of the classroom. This is one example of many, many good links and blogs and articles that we have on teachingenglish.org.uk, which I strongly recommend you have a look at. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us today. And I hope to see you again soon at future webinars. And yeah, as Alexander said, social pressure could be efficient. It is a very efficient one. And I'll see you soon. Thank you for watching. And I hope those action points and statements of belief